David Chen never thought he would question everything he had built. At 51 years old, he sat in his corner office on the 40th floor of the glass tower that bore his company's name. Outside his window, the city stretched endlessly, millions of people going about their daily lives. But inside this marble and mahogany sanctuary, David felt more alone than ever. It had taken him 22 years to build his technology company from a small garage startup into a billion-dollar empire. What started as a dream, shared with two college friends, had grown into something massive. 10,000 employees now depended on the company for their livelihoods. The stock price hit new records every quarter. Business magazines featured him on their covers. Yet something felt terribly wrong. The trouble began 3 months earlier, during what should have been a celebration. The company had just announced record profits for the 4th quarter in a row. The board members were thrilled. Shareholders were happy. But David noticed something troubling in the quarterly employee satisfaction report that landed on his desk that Tuesday morning. The numbers were brutal. Employee happiness had dropped to the lowest point in the company's history. People were leaving faster than they could be replaced. The anonymous feedback was even worse. Workers complained about feeling invisible, unheard, and undervalued. Many said management lived in a bubble, completely out of touch with reality. David remembered staring at those numbers for hours. How had this happened? He genuinely believed he ran a good company. The executive team seemed competent. The policies looked fair on paper. Yet somehow, thousands of people who worked for him felt forgotten and ignored. He called an emergency meeting with his leadership team the next day. Around the polished conference table sat 12 of his most trusted executives. Each earned more in a month than most employees made in a year. Each drove luxury cars and lived in expensive neighborhoods. Each seemed surprised by the employee satisfaction scores. "It's probably just a few troublemakers," suggested Tom, the head of human resources. "You know how people complain these days. They expect everything handed to them." Lisa, the operations director, nodded in agreement. "We've got great benefits compared to our competitors. Maybe we need better communication about what we offer." David listened to their explanations, but something didn't sit right. These were smart people, yet their responses felt hollow. They talked about employees like numbers on a spreadsheet rather than real human beings with families, dreams, and struggles. That evening, David stayed late in his office. The building grew quiet as workers headed home to their families. From his window, he watched the cleaning crews arrive. Small groups of people in gray uniforms entered through the side doors carrying supplies and equipment. He had seen them countless times before but never really noticed them. They were just part of the background, like the furniture or the paintings on the walls. A memory surfaced from his childhood. His father had worked as a maintenance worker at a factory for 30 years. David remembered how his dad would come home exhausted, his hands rough and stained, but always with stories about the people he worked with. His father knew everyone's names, their family situations, their hopes and concerns. The executives at that factory, his father once told him, never learned his name despite 3 decades of service. The realization hit David like a punch to the stomach. He had become one of those executives. He lived in a world of meetings, reports, and strategic planning, completely separated from the people who actually made his company run. When was the last time he had spoken to someone who wasn't a fellow executive or a client? When had he last walked through the areas where most of his employees actually worked? He thought about his assistant, Jenny, who had worked for him for 8 years. She knew his schedule better than he did, handled his appointments, and solved problems before he even knew they existed. Yet he realized he knew almost nothing about her life outside work. Did she have children? What were her dreams? What challenges did she face? The more David thought about it, the more he understood the problem. His company had grown so large that layers of management separated him from the reality of daily operations. Information filtered up through multiple levels, getting sanitized and summarized at each step. By the time anything reached his desk, it bore little resemblance to the actual experience of working there. Traditional employee surveys clearly weren't working. People either didn't participate or gave sanitized answers they thought management wanted to hear. Focus groups were run by consultants who asked generic questions and produced generic reports. Exit interviews happened after people had already decided to leave when it was too late to fix anything. David needed to understand what was really happening in his company, but how? He couldn't just walk around as the CEO and expect honest feedback. People would tell him what they thought he wanted to hear. They would hide problems and present everything in the best possible light. His presence would change the entire dynamic of any interaction. That night, David couldn't sleep. David couldn't. He walked around his empty house thinking about the disconnect between his perception and reality. He had built his company on the belief that taking care of employees would lead to success. Somewhere along the way, that philosophy had gotten lost in the complexity of growth and the pressure of profits. By morning, David had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He would go undercover in his own company, not as an executive observing from above, but as a regular employee working alongside the people he claimed to care about. He would see the company through their eyes, experience their daily challenges, and understand what it really meant to work there. The idea was risky and unprecedented. No CEO of a major corporation had ever attempted anything like this. If word got out, it could create a public relations nightmare. Shareholders might question his judgment. Competitors could use it against him. But David realized that continuing to lead from ignorance was a much greater risk. He spent the next week planning his transformation. The night shift seemed like the perfect opportunity. Most executives went home by 6 in the evening, leaving the building to the cleaning crews, security guards, and maintenance workers. These were the invisible employees who kept the company running while everyone else slept. David decided he would become Roberto Valdez, a newly hired janitor who needed the job to support his elderly mother. The backstory felt authentic because it connected to his own family history. His grandmother had cleaned office buildings when she first came to America, working nights while raising 5 children during the day. Creating the disguise required help, but David couldn't trust just anyone with this secret. He finally confided in Jenny, his assistant. Her initial reaction was shock, then concern for his safety and sanity. But as David explained his reasoning, she began to understand. She had seen the employee satisfaction reports. She had heard the whispers in the hallways. She knew something needed to change. Jenny helped coordinate the practical details. She would handle David's executive responsibilities remotely, rescheduling meetings and managing his calendar to create the necessary time blocks. She arranged for the physical transformation, including work clothes, a realistic backstory, and even some stage makeup to age his appearance and roughen his hands. The most challenging part was getting hired without raising suspicions. Jenny used her connections in human resources to ensure Roberto Valdez's application went through proper channels. On paper, he looked like any other applicant. Previous cleaning experience, reliable references, and an immediate need for work. David practiced his new identity for days. He studied the employee handbook from a janitor's perspective. He learned about union regulations, safety procedures, and company policies that he had never needed to understand as an executive. He memorized details about Roberto's fictional family and work history. The night before his first shift, David stood in his office looking out at the city one last time as CEO. Tomorrow, he would enter the same building through a different door, wearing different clothes, carrying different concerns. He would punch a time clock instead of setting his own schedule. He would take orders instead of giving them. He would see his company from the bottom up instead of the top down. David felt nervous in a way he hadn't experienced since starting his first business. Back then, he had been afraid of failing as an entrepreneur. Now, he was afraid of what he might discover about himself as a leader. What if the problems in his company ran deeper than he imagined? What if he had become the kind of executive he once promised never to be? But there was no turning back now. The experiment would begin in 12 hours. David Chen, Billionaire CEO, was about to disappear. In his place, Roberto Valdez would clock in for his first night shift, ready to learn what his own employees really thought about the company he had spent his life building. As he gathered his personal items and prepared to leave his office, David made himself a promise. Whatever he discovered during this month undercover, He would act on it. This wouldn't be just an interesting experiment or a story to tell at business conferences. It would be the beginning of real change, no matter how difficult or expensive that change might be. The elevator doors closed behind him, carrying him down from the 40th floor toward a completely different perspective on everything he thought he knew about success, leadership, and the human cost of building an empire. Roberto Valdez clocked in at exactly 6 o'clock on a Monday evening. David had practiced this moment dozens of times in his mind, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of walking through the employee entrance wearing a gray uniform, with his name stitched above the pocket. The locker room smelled like industrial soap and worn leather. Other workers were changing clothes and chatting about their day. David fumbled with his combination lock, his hands shaking slightly from nerves. A kind voice spoke up behind him. "First day?" asked Rosa, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, but a warm smile. She had been cleaning offices for 23 years and had seen countless new hires come and go. "Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it. Just follow me tonight and I'll show you the ropes." David nodded gratefully. Rosa became his unofficial mentor, teaching him which supplies worked best on different surfaces, how to organize his cart efficiently, and most importantly, how to stay invisible while still doing good work. "The key," Rosa explained as they loaded their carts, "is to clean everything perfectly but never disturb anyone. We're like ghosts in this building. People don't see us, and that's how they like it." The physical work hit David harder than expected. Within the first hour, his back ached from bending over trash cans. His hands, soft from years of office work, began developing blisters from gripping the mop handle. The cleaning supplies made his eyes water and his throat burn. By midnight, every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to what he witnessed in terms of how people treated the cleaning staff. During those first few nights, David watched in horror as employees walked past him without any acknowledgement. He had become invisible, just as Rosa predicted. On his third night, David was mopping the floor near the elevator when two managers he recognized stepped out. They were discussing budget cuts and laughing about their upcoming vacation plans. One of them actually stepped on David's freshly mopped floor without apologizing, or even seeming to notice he was there. They continued their conversation about reducing operational costs while David stood there holding his mop, feeling like a piece of furniture. The worst incident happened during his second week. David was cleaning the executive conference room where he had held countless meetings as CEO. A senior manager named Bradley entered with a client, completely ignoring David's presence. They discussed confidential business deals, while David emptied trash cans just feet away from them. It was as if he didn't exist. But Bradley's behavior toward Rosa the next evening truly opened David's eyes. Rosa had accidentally missed emptying one small trash can in Bradley's office. Instead of simply mentioning it, Bradley called her supervisor and demanded she be written up for poor performance. He spoke about Rosa like she was incompetent, questioning whether she was capable of doing such a simple job. David watched Rosa's face during this humiliation. This woman who had raised 4 children while working nights, who knew more about building maintenance than most facility managers, who had never missed a day of work in 5 years, stood there accepting criticism over one forgotten trash can. She didn't defend herself or make excuses. She just nodded and promised it wouldn't happen again. That night, David learned that Rosa had been submitting written suggestions for improving cleaning efficiency for years. She had ideas about better supply storage, more effective scheduling, and equipment upgrades that could save both time and money. Every suggestion had been ignored by management. No one had ever responded to her letters or acknowledged her ideas. During their midnight break, Rosa shared her frustrations with David over lukewarm coffee from the vending machine. "They think we're stupid because we clean toilets," she said, quietly. "But I've been watching this building for over 20 years. I know where every problem is, what needs fixing, and how to make things run better. Nobody wants to hear it from someone like me." David met other workers who challenged every assumption he had about the people who worked in his building. There was Carlos, a former engineer who had lost his job during an economic downturn and now worked nights to pay for his daughter's college tuition. He spoke 3 languages fluently and had innovative ideas about energy efficiency that could saved the company thousands of dollars monthly. Linda used to be a high school teacher before budget cuts eliminated her position. She organized the supply closets with mathematical precision and had developed a system for tracking inventory that was more accurate than the company's official methods. But no one in management knew about her background or capabilities. Then, there was Miguel, who worked 3 different jobs to support his family. He arrived at the building each night after finishing his day job at a grocery store, worked until 6 in the morning, then went home to help his kids get ready for school, before catching a few hours of sleep. Despite his exhaustion, Miguel always had a positive attitude and looked out for his coworkers. David began to understand that many of his night shift employees were highly educated, experienced professionals who had fallen on hard times or couldn't find work in their fields. They weren't just cleaning his building. They were brilliant people with valuable insights and ideas that no one bothered to ask for. The working conditions shocked David even more than the treatment by other employees. The cleaning equipment was old and frequently broken. Safety protocols existed on paper but weren't followed in practice. Workers were expected to use harsh chemicals without proper ventilation. Several employees had developed respiratory problems from years of exposure. The staffing was so tight that workers rarely got their scheduled breaks. David learned that people regularly worked through their lunch periods to finish their assigned areas. Some workers had been injured on the job but were afraid to report it because they needed the income and feared being seen as troublemakers. Most heartbreaking was discovering that several of his employees were homeless. They slept in their cars, in the parking garage between shifts, or found other temporary places to rest. Their wages weren't enough to afford housing in the expensive city where his company was located. Yet they continued showing up every night, maintaining the building where executives made decisions worth millions while earning barely enough to survive. David's perspective on his own company changed completely during those long nights. He saw how decisions made in boardrooms affected real people's lives. Cost-cutting measures that looked good on financial reports translated into broken equipment, reduced hours, and increased workloads for people who were already struggling. One night, while cleaning the boardroom where he had approved those very cost cuts, David felt the full weight of his disconnection from reality. He remembered sitting in that same room 6 months earlier, reviewing proposals to reduce janitorial expenses. The numbers had seemed reasonable then. Now he understood that those savings came directly from the pockets and well-being of people, like Rosa, Carlos, and Miguel. The company's hierarchy became crystal clear from the bottom up. Information flowed upward through multiple layers of management, getting filtered and softened at each level. Problems that seemed urgent to frontline workers became minor issues by the time they reached executive decision-makers. Solutions that made sense to people doing the actual work were dismissed as impractical by managers who had never performed those jobs. David also discovered an underground network of mutual support among the cleaning staff. Workers shared rides, covered for each other during family emergencies, and pooled resources to help colleagues in crisis. This community existed entirely outside the company's official structure, providing the human connection and support that should have been part of the workplace culture. During his 3rd week, David overheard a conversation that chilled him to the bone. 2 executives were discussing upcoming layoffs in the janitorial department. They talked about reducing headcount to improve quarterly numbers, completely detached from the human impact of their decisions. They used terms like optimization and efficiency gains while planning to eliminate jobs that real people depended on to feed their families. David realized that his month undercover was revealing problems that went far deeper than employee satisfaction scores. His company had created a system that dehumanized workers, treating them as expenses to be minimized rather than people to be valued. The culture he thought he had built was actually a hierarchy that separated executives from employees so completely that they might as well have been living in different worlds. Every night brought new revelations about the gap between policy and practice, between executive intentions and employee experiences. David began to understand that good leadership wasn't about having the right policies on paper or making inspiring speeches. It was about creating genuine connections with people and understanding how decisions affected their daily lives. As his 4th week began, David knew that his experiment would soon end, but the lessons he was learning would stay with him forever. He had entered this building as a successful CEO who thought he understood his company. He was leaving as Roberto Valdez, a night shift janitor who finally understood what leadership really meant. By his third week as Roberto Valdez, David had settled into the rhythm of night shift work. His hands had toughened, his back had adapted to the constant bending and lifting, and he had learned to navigate the building efficiently with his cleaning cart. But more importantly, he had begun forming genuine friendships with people he never would have met as CEO. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult shift. David was struggling to move a heavy trash bin when Carlos noticed his difficulty and immediately came to help. As they worked together, Carlos began sharing stories about his previous life as a mechanical engineer. He had designed systems for manufacturing plants before the economic downturn cost him his job 5 years earlier. "I used to make good money," Carlos said quietly as they emptied the bin. "Had a nice house, 2 cars, took family vacations every summer. Then the plant closed and everything changed overnight. I sent out hundreds of applications, but nobody wants to hire an engineer who's been out of work for months." David listened with growing amazement as Carlos described his current situation. Despite his advanced degree and years of experience, he couldn't find work in his field. Age discrimination was real, though nobody would admit it. Younger engineers were cheaper to hire and perceived as more current with technology. So Carlos worked nights cleaning the same type of office buildings where he used to design complex systems. "The funny thing is," Carlos continued with a bitter laugh, "I see so many inefficiencies in this building every night. The ventilation system runs poorly, the lighting is wasteful, and the maintenance schedules make no sense. I could fix most of these problems and save the company serious money, but who's going to listen to a janitor?" That conversation opened David's eyes to something he had never considered. His company was surrounded by expertise that management completely ignored. Carlos wasn't just a janitor who happened to be educated. He was a skilled professional whose knowledge could benefit the organization if anyone bothered to ask. The relationship with Rosa deepened during their shared midnight breaks. She began treating David like a younger brother, sharing wisdom gained from decades of working life. Rosa had raised 4 children essentially as a single mother while working various cleaning jobs. Her husband had left when the kids were small, and she had supported the family through determination and multiple jobs. "People think this work is beneath them," Rosa explained one night as they sat in the break room, "but there's dignity in any honest work. I kept my family together, put all my kids through high school, and helped my oldest daughter get into college. I'm proud of what I accomplished." Rosa's insights about the building's operations amazed David. She knew which offices generated the most waste, which department stayed latest, and which equipment needed replacement. She had developed efficient cleaning routes that saved time and reduced supply usage. Most impressively, she had been documenting all of this information for years in detailed reports that she submitted to management. "I write everything down," Rosa said, showing David a worn notebook filled with her observations. "Energy waste, supply needs, safety hazards, suggestions for improvement. I give copies to the supervisors every month. Sometimes I wonder if they even read them." David knew they didn't. As CEO, he had never seen Rosa's reports. They were probably sitting in some supervisor's drawer, dismissed as unimportant feedback from cleaning staff. The waste of knowledge and insight was staggering. Miguel's story touched David most deeply. This quiet man worked 3 jobs to support his family, including his elderly parents and his own children. He arrived at the office building each evening after completing 8 hours at a grocery store, then worked until 6 in the morning before heading home to help his kids prepare for school. "Sleep is a luxury I can't afford," Miguel admitted during one of their conversations. "But my daughter wants to be a doctor and my son loves computers. If working extra hours helps them achieve their dreams, it's worth the sacrifice." Despite his exhaustion, Miguel was incredibly observant about the building's security and maintenance needs. He noticed patterns that day shift workers missed, identified potential problems before they became expensive repairs, and had innovative ideas about improving efficiency. His suggestions weren't written in formal reports like Rosa's, but they were equally valuable. David began to realize that the night shift workers formed a tight community of mutual support. When Linda's car broke down, Carlos organized rides for her. When Miguel's son needed help with math homework, Rosa tutored him during breaks. When David himself struggled with particularly difficult cleaning tasks, everyone pitched in to help. This community existed entirely outside the company's official structure. Management had no idea about the informal networks that helped employees survive and thrive. The support system they had created among themselves was more effective than any corporate wellness program or employee assistance initiative. The fourth week brought David's most shocking discovery yet. While cleaning executive offices late one night, he overheard a phone conversation that made his blood run cold. Bradley, the same manager who had humiliated Rosa over a missed trash can, was discussing staff reductions with someone from corporate headquarters. "We can easily cut 20% from janitorial without affecting operations," Bradley said confidently. "These people are overpaid for simple work. Automation and efficiency improvements will make up the difference." David stood frozen outside, Bradley's office mop in hand, listening to his own employee discuss eliminating jobs that real people depended on. Bradley spoke about workers like they were line items in a budget, rather than human beings with families, dreams, and financial obligations. The conversation continued with Bradley suggesting they could outsource cleaning to a contractor who would pay even lower wages without benefits. "It's all about maximizing shareholder value," he concluded. "Sentiment can't drive business decisions." That night, David couldn't concentrate on his work. He kept thinking about Rosa's 4 children, Carlos's engineering expertise going to waste, Miguel's sacrifice to educate his kids, and Linda's dedication despite being overqualified for her position. These weren't abstract employees or budget line items. They were real people whose lives would be devastated by the casual decisions being made in corporate offices. During his break, David found himself in the parking garage where several employees spent their time between shifts. He discovered that 3 workers, including a young man named Tony, were actually living in their cars. They couldn't afford apartments on janitorial wages in the expensive city, but they needed the job to survive. Tony was particularly heartbreaking. He was 24 years old with a college degree in business administration. Student loans and a difficult job market had forced him into survival mode. He worked nights cleaning offices, slept in his car during the day, and used the gym membership that came with his health benefits to shower and stay clean. "I never imagined my life would turn out like this," Tony confided to David. "I did everything right. Studied hard, got good grades, graduated with honors. But the entry-level jobs in my field don't pay enough to live on, and nobody wants to hire someone without experience. So here I am, cleaning bathrooms with a business degree." David realized that his company's wage structure created impossible situations for workers. The cost of living in the city where his headquarters was located had skyrocketed, but janitorial wages had remained essentially flat for years. Employees were trapped in a cycle where they couldn't afford to live near their jobs but couldn't afford to quit and find work elsewhere. The most profound moment came when David was cleaning his own executive office. Standing in the space where he had made countless decisions affecting thousands of lives, he felt the full weight of his disconnect from reality. The expensive artwork, imported furniture, and luxury amenities in his office could fund salary increases for dozens of workers. He stared at his own portrait hanging on the wall, the successful CEO in an expensive suit surrounded by symbols of achievement. Meanwhile, he stood there in janitor's coveralls, finally understanding the human cost of corporate success. Every decision to maximize profits had been made without considering the impact on people like Rosa, Carlos, Miguel, Linda, and Tony. The irony was devastating. His company's mission statement spoke about valuing employees and creating opportunities for growth. Marketing materials emphasized corporate social responsibility and community investment. Annual reports highlighted workforce development initiatives. Yet the reality experienced by thousands of workers was completely different from the corporate narrative. David began to understand that good intentions at the executive level meant nothing if they didn't translate into actual experiences for workers. Policies that looked progressive on paper were meaningless if supervisors and middle managers treated employees poorly. Company values were just words if they weren't reflected in daily interactions and compensation decisions. As his undercover experiment neared its end, David knew that everything would have to change. He couldn't return to his executive office and pretend he hadn't seen the reality of working life in his own company. The relationships he had formed, the stories he had heard, and the dignity he had witnessed among workers facing impossible circumstances had changed him permanently. Roberto Valdez would clock out for the final time in a few days, but the lessons learned during these 4 weeks would shape every decision David made as CEO from that moment forward. David's final night as Roberto Valdez was the longest of his life. As he cleaned the executive offices one last time, he practiced the speech he would give the next morning. His hands shook as he emptied trash cans and mopped floors, knowing that in a few hours everything would change forever. At 5:30 in the morning, David made an announcement over the building's communication system. All employees were requested to gather in the main auditorium at 6 o'clock for an important company meeting. The timing was unusual, catching both night shift and early morning workers before the day shift arrived. Confused employees filed into the auditorium, still wearing their work uniforms. Rosa sat with her cleaning cart beside her, worried she might be in trouble for leaving her duties unfinished. Carlos wondered if the company was announcing layoffs. Miguel checked his watch nervously, knowing he needed to get home to help his children get ready for school. When David walked onto the stage in his regular clothes, the gasps and murmurs filled the room. Workers looked at each other in confusion, trying to understand what was happening. Some recognized him from company, photos and news articles. Others had never seen the CEO in person before. "My name is David Chen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "For the past month, I have worked alongside many of you as Roberto Valdez, a member of the night shift cleaning crew." The silence was deafening. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth in shock. Carlos leaned forward in disbelief. Miguel stared with wide eyes, trying to process what he was hearing. The man they had shared coffee with, helped with difficult tasks, and treated as a friend was actually the billionaire owner of the company. "I want to start by apologizing," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for the deception, but for years of leadership that allowed conditions in this company to become unacceptable. I have failed you as a leader, and I take full responsibility for that failure." He began sharing specific stories from his month undercover, being careful not to embarrass anyone but making his experiences real and personal. He talked about Rosa's brilliant efficiency suggestions that had been ignored for years. He mentioned Carlos's engineering expertise that could save the company millions of dollars. He spoke about Miguel's incredible work ethic and the impossible financial pressures he faced. "I learned that this company employs some of the most dedicated, intelligent, and hard-working people I have ever met," David said. "Yet we have treated you as invisible, ignored your ideas, and failed to provide the respect and compensation you deserve." The audience remained stunned. Some workers whispered to each other, still unable to believe what they were hearing. Others began to show signs of anger as they realized they had been part of an experiment without their knowledge or consent. David acknowledged their feelings directly. "I know some of you may feel manipulated or used by what I did. You have every right to be angry. But I want you to know that every conversation we had, every moment we shared, was genuine on my part. The friendships I formed during these weeks are real, and they have changed me as a person." He then began announcing the changes that would take effect immediately. The minimum wage for all company employees would increase by 50%, effective with the next paycheck. Every worker would receive profit-sharing bonuses based on the company's performance. Health benefits would be expanded to cover family members at no additional cost to employees. But David knew that money alone wouldn't fix the deeper problems he had discovered. He announced structural changes that would transform how the company operated. Rosa was immediately promoted to Director of Facility Operations, with her years of suggestions finally receiving the attention and resources they deserved. Carlos would lead a new efficiency task force, using his engineering background, to identify and implement cost-saving improvements throughout the company. His first project would be redesigning the building systems to reduce energy waste and improve working conditions. Miguel would become the company's first employee advocate, a new position created to ensure that worker concerns reached executive leadership without being filtered or ignored by middle management. His experience juggling multiple jobs and supporting his family would help him understand the challenges other employees faced. David announced that he was moving his office from the 40th floor to the ground level, next to the employee break room. His door would be open to any worker who wanted to speak with him directly. He would also institute monthly shifts where all executives would work alongside frontline employees, learning about their jobs and challenges firsthand. The company would establish an innovation fund specifically for employee suggestions, with financial rewards for ideas that improved operations or working conditions. Workers would be encouraged to share their expertise, regardless of their official job title or educational background. For employees like Tony who were struggling with housing costs, the company would provide low-interest loans for apartment deposits and offer temporary housing assistance. A new career development program would help workers advance within the company, with tuition assistance for those wanting to pursue additional education or training. The changes weren't just about policies and benefits. David knew that the company culture needed fundamental transformation. All managers would undergo training about treating employees with dignity and respect. Performance evaluations would include feedback from the workers they supervised, not just their own supervisors. The company would also establish worker committees with real power to influence decisions affecting their jobs. These wouldn't be symbolic groups that management could ignore, but genuine partnerships where employee voices carried weight in operational decisions. As David outlined these changes, he watched the faces in the audience transform from shock to cautious hope. Rosa wiped tears from her eyes as she realized her years of suggestions would finally be implemented. Carlos sat straighter, as he understood his engineering knowledge would be valued again. Miguel smiled as he thought about the financial pressure being lifted from his family. But David's most important announcement came last. "This company exists because of your work, your dedication, and your expertise," he said. "From now on, you will be treated as the valuable partners you have always been, not as costs to be minimized or problems to be managed." He shared his realization that the company's success meant nothing if it came at the expense of employee dignity and well-being. Profits were important, but not more important than the people who made those profits possible. The immediate implementation of changes shocked everyone, including David's own executive team. By noon that day, HR was processing wage increases for over 3,000 employees. Facility managers were meeting with Rosa to discuss her improvement suggestions. Carlos was reviewing building systems with the engineering department. The story of David's undercover experiment spread quickly through business news and social media. Other CEOs called to understand how he had pulled off such an elaborate investigation. Business schools requested case studies about his experience. Workers from other companies shared their own stories of feeling invisible and undervalued. But the real measure of success came in the following months. Employee satisfaction scores reached record highs within 6 weeks. Productivity increased as workers felt valued and heard for the first time in years. The company's stock price initially dropped as investors worried about increased labor costs, but then rose to new heights as efficiency improvements and reduced turnover more than compensated for higher wages. Most importantly, the relationships David had formed during his month undercover continued to flourish. Rosa became one of his most trusted advisors, bringing years of operational wisdom to executive decision-making. Carlos's efficiency improvements saved the company over $3 million in the first year alone. Miguel's advocacy helped identify and solve dozens of problems that had been ignored by traditional management structures. The experiment also inspired other companies to examine their own treatment of workers. Several corporations implemented similar transparency initiatives, though none went as far as David's complete identity transformation. Tony, the young man who had been living in his car, became a symbol of the company's transformation. With housing, assistance, and career development support, he moved into an apartment and began advancing through the company's management training program. 2 years later, he was promoted to assistant manager in the business development department. David's personal transformation was equally dramatic. The executive, who had once felt disconnected from his employees, now spent at least one day each month working alongside frontline workers. He never forgot the lessons learned during those 4 weeks when he was Roberto Valdez. The company's mission statement was rewritten to reflect its new values. We succeed because our employees succeed. Every person who works here deserves dignity, respect, and the opportunity to thrive. Unlike the previous corporate language, these words reflected actual practices and policies. Years later, David would say that his month as a janitor taught him more about leadership than his entire business education. He learned that true success isn't measured just in profits and stock prices, but in the lives and well-being of the people who make success possible. The experiment proved that authentic leadership requires the courage to see your organization through the eyes of those who keep it running. It showed that every employee, regardless of their title or education level, has valuable contributions to make if leaders are willing to listen. Most importantly, it demonstrated that treating workers with dignity and respect isn't just morally right, it's also good business. When employees feel valued and heard, they become more productive, more creative, and more committed to their company's success. David's transformation from distant CEO to engaged leader created a ripple effect that changed thousands of lives and redefined what corporate leadership could look like in the modern world.